Esta é minha primeira viagem ao Brasil e estou muito alegre para visitar São Paulo. Obrigada para a sua bem-vindo. And I'm afraid that's the limit. And I apologize for the pronunciation. Somebody can come and teach me afterwards how to say it. So, are science and religion in conflict in modern history? I'd like to just do a little bit of audience survey. So, if you've been told this at some stage in your life, would you like to just raise your hand? Have you heard that science and religion are in conflict from somebody else telling you this? Maybe a teacher, a friend, the news, your professor, somebody like that. Just keep your hand up. Okay, so probably at least 50% of the room have been told this at some stage. And many people not only think that, but put that view across very strongly. I've just come across 3 quotes that I found from the UK. This is A.C. Grayling, is an atheist philosopher in the UK. He was talking about education. He said, "It is a form of intellectual abuse to indoctrinate children by making it seem as though religious beliefs have the truth status and credentials of, say, chemistry or geography." And then a few decades ago, another atheist in the UK, "Science is almost totally incompatible with religion. The only point of compatibility is that there are well-meaning and honest people on both sides who are genuinely and deeply concerned with discovering the truth about this wonderful world. That having been said, there is no actual compatibility between science and religion." And going back 100 years or more, John Draper in 1874, I think, published a book, we'll hear a little bit more about it later on, in which he said, "The history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries, it is a narrative of the conflict of 2 contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on one side and the compression arising from the traditionary faith and human interests on the other." 3 views that conflict exists between science and religion, and the 2 are incompatible. And as this last quote shows, the conflict or warfare myth is something that's been perpetuated in the history of science and religion. The myth that science tried and succeeded in suppressing the irrational faith of the church, and that the church was concerned to hold back progress and suppress the truth. Now, this view, the conflict view, the view that science and the church were implacably opposed to one another in the history of the modern world, is something that historians of science reject. And a couple of quotes here. "In the late Victorian period, it was common to write about the warfare between science and religion, and to presume that the 2 bodies of culture must always have been in conflict. However, it is a very long time since these attitudes have been held by historians of science." And David Lindberg says, "The notion of conflict refuses to die." So as far as historians of science are concerned, the conflict in the history of science and religion is a myth. As far as public perception is concerned, it's still alive and well. How did this conflict view arise, and why is it still too strong? And that's what I want to look at a little bit today. We're going to look at the development of scientific thought and understanding. We're going to consider how it was related to religious belief and practice. And I'm going to highlight 2 particular myths that are often part of the atheistic critique of religion. Now, just a little warning. Historian of science John Hedley Brooke, among other historians, warn us of the complexity of looking into the history of culture in this way. It's not just a case of science in isolation and religion in isolation, however you see them coming together. It's part of a complex and changing world in which politics and social issues and cultural changes are all happening. There are social and political undercurrents going on. There are conflicts happening at different levels other than the interaction between science and religion. And we need to bear that in mind as we think about this question, as we do when we do anything historical. Just before we get on to the modern period, I want to do a very, very brief overview of pre-modern periods. Oh, that's the quote I was referring to from John Hedley Brooke. Let's just think about, for example, the ancient world, prehistoric humans trying to find out about the world that they live in, making discoveries such as how to make tools, fire, build shelters, practical knowledge about the natural world. Also perhaps starting to inquire about nature, thinking about God and gods and where gods live and where gods come from and how they came to be, how people came on the earth. Ancient worldviews and cosmologies abound. So, for example, the ancient myths in written texts such as the Gilgamesh epic, the Babylonian creation myth, or even perhaps the Hebrew scriptures. And then perhaps we might want to think about the era of Greek philosophy. So as early as 600 BCE, people like Pythagoras and Euclid were forming some of the mathematical ideas that we still rely on today. And I have to say to you, as someone who's not a scientist, Pythagoras' theorem is the only theorem I can tell you to this day what it is, and that's because it was drilled into me at school. But that's something that's thousands of years old. If we move on to the early church, there is a view amongst some that the early church were hostile to natural philosophy as science, as we now know it, was referred to. The word science only really came into being in the modern era. So natural philosophy, was the church opposed to it? Well, it would be true to say that the early church fathers thought that natural philosophy should always be the handmaid of theology. In other words, theology was more important. But a number of the church fathers really supported scientific learning about the world, and saw it as an important part of learning and study. And so in this picture of Saint Jerome, you can see on his desk, the artist has put some scientific instruments just there, just to indicate that perhaps he too was interested in measuring and calculating and understanding the world. Between the 9th and the 12th century, a number of works of Greek natural philosophy, Aristotle and Plato and other Greek works, were translated into Arabic, and so birthed what is called the Islamic Golden Age of science in the Arab-speaking world, and in Southern Europe, particularly in Spain. And that kind of flowered, and then almost just as quickly died away, and nobody really knows quite why. There are all sorts of questions about that, and I haven't got time to go into it. But that was a time of intense scientific, or intense inquiry about the world. And then if we move to the Middle Ages, in theological terms, perhaps we might think most closely of Thomas Aquinas, whose concern is to reconcile faith and reason, to present rational arguments for God, and to use logic to defend faith. So he's using some of Aristotle's principles to apply them to the Christian tradition, to Christian faith. And at the same time, you have a great interest in observing nature, understanding the natural world. And the picture on the left of your screen is from a medieval bestiary, which is a book with illustrations of nature created, actually this was created in about the year 1270. And it shows a picture of two lions reviving a cub. And the text goes on to say that the lion cub did not breathe until 3 days after it was born, and the lions had to revive it by breathing into it. So perhaps a mixture of sort of superstition and observation starting to come in. Also in the Middle Ages, a great increase in interest in medicinal plants, and the monasteries of Western Europe became places where investigation on plants and their medicinal properties became to the fore, and most monasteries had a herbarium, which is where they studied and grew plants that they could use to heal people. And the writers and theologians of this period, although they were looking at the world and trying to observe it, they still saw it as very much God's world. I take nothing away from God. All things in the world are made by God except evil, but he made other things through the operation of nature, which is the instrument of divine operation. And here you first start to see an idea that God creates, but he does it by means of nature, of the natural order. And that is something that will come to the floor for later on in our discourse. Okay, we're going to move on to what is called the scientific revolution. And I've put that word in quotes because it's a bit of a debated term whether this really is how things pan out, and we'll look at that a little bit more later on. But generally speaking, the scientific revolution is the 150-year period following the publication of Copernicus' book on the revelation of the celestial spheres in 1543. There's an illustration of it there. Why so significant? Well, this work, this published work, was really the start in kind of modern physics of astronomy of a heliocentric worldview. This is the time when the view that the Earth and the other planets orbited around the Sun was beginning to be put out there, as opposed to the Ptolemaic view, which was that the Earth was the center of the universe and the Sun and the planets revolved around it. In Copernicus's book, it was a theory only. It was later revised by people like, well, that's Copernicus's diagram, and you can see right in the middle there, Sol, the sun, right at the heart. People like Galileo, some decades later, invents the first telescope at the start of the 17th century, so he's able to actually make observation to show that Copernicus's ideas are correct. And Kepler, this is a model that Kepler made of the universe. This is, in one sense, quite radical. It has implications because the traditional theological view of the view that the Earth is the center means that actually human beings are right at the center of God's creation. And when you start to bring in the idea that actually the Earth may no longer be at the center, you're introducing ideas that perhaps human beings are not at the center of God's purposes. So this is radical. This is something that causes some consternation in some camps. Alongside this, Newton, universal laws of gravitation, the worldview is changing. The worldview is changing from a view of the world that's closed and partitioned and a spherical cosmos to a universe as we know it, or perhaps not as big as we know it. And it questions a lot of things. One of the hallmarks of this period is the whole importance of observation. And I've already talked about Galileo. Observation and rigorous experimental method are coming to the fore. And so we've already heard Roberto refer to this. Newton, in his book Optics, says, "My design in this book is not to explain the properties of light by hypotheses, but to prove them, to propose and prove them by reason and experiments." So we've got here a kind of a new way of looking at the world developing. It's not something that happens just like this, it's something that is developing. And a number of historians have said that actually this is a real breaking point with the past. This is a separation from what has been before. This is radically new, what's called the separation theory. And they say that for very various reasons. I'll just highlight them very quickly. So there are new theories of matter coming to play, new theories of causality and new ideas about method. This is different from what's been before. The universe is increasingly being seen as a mechanical system that functions in a particular way, rather than just the theatre in which God plays out his providential actions. The traditional links between nature and God are coming into question, and some of them are perhaps being broken. And for some people, this is seen as undermining the authority of the Bible. And then also, as we will see a little bit more about in a moment, this is the time which brought the Church and Galileo into conflict with one another. It's interesting, actually, I mean, the idea of the Bible having diminished authority. What's actually probably happening is that it's becoming more independent from, science is becoming more independent from biblical constraint. And there's a very famous quote by Galileo in a letter to Grand Duchess Christina, where he says, "The Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heaven goes. Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heaven goes." I don't know if that translates into in Portuguese. Are the words for heaven the same? Don't know. Maybe it doesn't translate too well. But in English, heaven is where God is, and also the heavens are the celestial, the stars and so on. Okay, so that's the separation theory. I want to put some points across that suggest it's not as simple as that, and that actually there isn't a radical separation between the sort of old way of looking at things and the new. And John Hedley Brooke, the historian I mentioned before, said that the separation theory is actually rather a crude picture, and it lacks detail. It's a sort of a broad brush approach, and of course historians perhaps sometimes like to generalize and make sweeping categorizations, but John Hedley Brooke warns us against doing that in this complex case. The mechanized view of the universe, the view of the universe that you could actually see how it worked and unpick how it worked, was often valued because it actually emphasized God's sovereignty over creation. And it didn't exclude divine activity. God could still be at work. And even Bacon conceded that scientific conclusions should be limited by religion. So for Bacon, as for Boyle and Newton after him, it was simply inconceivable that from a chance distribution and collision of atoms, a world of such order could have been produced. The role of the Bible was still important. And actually, prior to this, in Calvin's great work of systematic theology, he had advised people against going to the Bible to learn astronomy. So already in some of the Reformation thinkers, the idea that the Bible was a scientific textbook was being undermined. That's not where you go to learn astronomy. Again, Francis Bacon, to conclude, therefore, let no man think or maintain that man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word, the Bible, or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy, natural philosophy in that case, but rather let men endeavour an endless progress or for proficience in both. So the idea is you should study the Bible, you should study natural philosophy, God's works, and both are important and they do not exclude each other. The second argument against the separation theory is that in this time, primary and secondary causes, i.e. natural causes, were accepted as important. And a third quote from Bacon: "It is a conceit, in other words, it is foolishness or arrogance, that too much knowledge should incline a man to atheism, and that the ignorance of second causes should make a more devout dependence on God, which is the first cause." In other words, he's countering the view that says too much, if you learn too much about the natural world, you will become atheist, and if you learn about second causes, secondary causation, if you're ignorant of it, you will be more godly. Bacon is countering that view and saying that actually both are important. The third thing that's happening at this time that goes against the separation theory is that actually scientific inquiry is often given theological reasons. The reasons for looking into the natural world is theological. And these are twofold. First is overcoming the effects of the fall. This is particularly a Protestant way of thinking, that when Adam fell in the garden, the beauty of Eden was disrupted, and by studying nature, humans will have, particularly godly humans, will have some way of overcoming that effect. Again, another quote from Bacon: "For man by the fall fell from his state of innocency and from his dominion over creation. Both of these losses, however, can even in this life be in some part repaired, the former by religion and faith, the latter by arts and sciences. For creation was not by the curse made altogether and forever a rebel." Now, there were many significant innovations in the 17th and 18th century that were given theological introductions. So, for example, this is Kepler. "I wished to be a theologian for a long time. I was troubled, but now see how God is also praised through my work in astronomy." So Kepler seeing himself doing God's work through his astronomy. And then Boyle, "Discovering to others," in other words, making known to others, "the perfections of God displayed in the creatures is a more acceptable act of religion than the burning of sacrifices or perfumes upon his altars." I think he was perhaps a fairly sort of nonconformist or low church in his theology. And he went on to say, "The rational contemplation of nature is philosophical worship of God." So for Boyle, what he did in his studies, for him was a form of worship, a way of worshipping God. And then if we think about the taxonomist Carl Linnaeus, he said this: "If the Maker has furnished this globe with the most admirable proofs of his wisdom and power, if this splendid theatre would be adorned in vain without a spectator, and if man is alone capable of considering the wonderful economy of the whole, it follows that man is made for the purpose of studying the Creator's works." So, says Linnaeus, the world is here and we are the ones that can understand it, and that is why we're here, to understand God's works. And then he went on to say, for the author of eternal salvation is also the Lord of nature. He who has destined us for future joys has at present put us in this world. So you can see for these natural philosophers what they're doing in their scientific endeavour, their measuring, their experimentation, their hypotheses, is part and parcel of their religious worldview. It's part and parcel of their beliefs in God. And they see what they're doing as, in a way, an outworking of that. And in that respect, perhaps not very different from many who are Christians and scientists today that see their work in the lab as part of their Christian worship. So the separation view needs to be treated with caution. And John Hedley Brooke says this, a change in the status of natural philosophy was certainly achieved as a result of the scientific revelation. So there was a change, things changed, the world is a different place, but, says Hedley Brooke, it's by differentiation from and reintegration with religious belief rather than by complete severance. So the view that there is a complete separation between science and religion as a result of the scientific revolution is not substantiated when you look at the lives of those who were doing it. They're having to rethink some things, and some of the language is changing, but it is not a separation. Okay, so I said we'd look at a couple of myths, and the Galileo myth, the Galileo affair, is the first one that I want to consider. So in about early 1600s, Galileo Galilei openly supported the Copernican theory of the Earth's motion. He'd invented and perfected the telescope. He started showing that telescope evidence supported Copernicus's views. And he did provoke criticism, and he did provoke accusations of heresy from conservative people. Interestingly, some of those were on scientific grounds, not on religious grounds. So, as I said, the view, the geocentric view of the world was much, was held very closely, and some scientists were unwilling to let go of that. And it did cause controversy, and Galileo was privately warned to keep quiet about it, and agreed to do so. And so far so good. He was just agreed to keep his views to himself while the rumpus carried on around him. But a couple of decades later, he published a satirical work called Dialogue, which showed that the arguments for the Earth's motion were stronger than, that the heliocentric view was stronger than the geocentric view. And he included in this satirical work a character called Simplicio, who was a loose caricature of the Pope of the day, Pope Urban VIII. So perhaps not a wise move, one might think, and so it was. The Pope got wind of this, the Pope wasn't very happy, and, well, the myth is that Galileo was tortured and imprisoned. In fact, evidence from letters at the time suggests he wasn't tortured. There's no record of him being tortured. He was made to recant. He did end his days in house arrest, but that was in the comfort of his own home. So there were sanctions against him, but it wasn't the torture, execution, whatever the myth has been perpetuated. And the reasons for his him being castigated by the authorities has a lot more to do with his own rather inept and unwise social skills, his lack of understanding of the politics of the papal court, and the fact that actually if you fairly blatantly disrespect the Pope, there are liable to be consequences. And it was, and also some of the political sort of jostling for power that was going on in the court at the time, as always happens, rather than an example of the church versus science. So the Galileo myth that this is the church squashing science is at best inaccurate, and I don't think it really holds up. So that's the first myth, and we'll come to the second one in a moment. Let's move on to the 19th century science, and you'll notice here I've got that title, science, that name science in the title. And this is the period when science, as we currently know it, becomes a category. It takes on the category of investigation in the way that we currently understand it. Peter Harrison therefore says, the notion that there can be a relationship between science and religion prior to the 19th century runs the risk of anachronism. He's not saying that there is no integration between natural philosophy, understanding nature, and religion prior to the 19th century, just that talking in terms of the relationship between science and religion, which we do now, is something that really only came to be a question under discussion in the 19th century onwards. Why did it emerge then? Well, before this, many of the people that did natural philosophy were also clergymen. There's a whole list of people that were clergymen and studied nature. His name's gone out of my mind. The vicar of Selborne. Vicar of Selborne, what's his name? Oh, these guys don't. Anyway, there are a whole number of particularly English naturalists that are clergymen as well. What happens in the 19th century is you get that science starts to become professionalized. You get organizations into scientific subdisciplines. You get learned societies starting to be formed. So whereas you had the category of natural philosophers before and just perhaps a few subcategories, now you've got biologists and geologists and chemists and so on and so forth. So we do have a changing world. And I have to say also, we're going to go on in a moment to look at the theory of evolution. But I do have to say that in England at the time, when all this is going on, Victorian England, there is massive upheavals going on in society, culturally and socially and politically, and those do have an effect. So let's have a little look at the theory of evolution. In 1859, Darwin publishes his On the Origin of Species, and not to mention Arthur Wallace, who also came up at almost the same time with the same, more or less, theory, but didn't quite get it in print as quickly. And myth number 2 that I want to talk about is the view that evolution and the church were in conflict, and that evolutionary theory still conflicts with Christian views. And actually, the modern era is going to leave to Dennis later on. In fact, when On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, it initially received mainly positive reception from clergymen and scientists. And it had its detractors, but those were equally scientists and religious people. So it wasn't a sort of split between science and religion. It was that some people, more conservative people, a new theory, have their questions about it. And as we will see a little bit later, I want to get on to how it was received elsewhere in the world. There are other issues often that go alongside it. But anyway, Darwin's supporters. This is the American botanist Asa Gray. And he said this: evolution may be as profoundly and particularly theistic as it is increasingly probable. The taint of atheism, which in Dr. Hodges' view leavens the whole lump, is not inherent in the original grain of Darwinism, in the principles posited, but has somehow been introduced into the subsequent treatment. So this is just 15 years after Darwin published, and some people are talking about it being atheistic, and Asa Gray is arguing, no, it's not. It's something that's been added. It's not something that is inherent within the book itself. And then another well-known American, B.B. Warfield from Princeton, said this: I do not think that there is any general statement in the Bible or any part of the account of creation, either as given in Genesis 1 and 2 or elsewhere alluded to, that need be opposed to evolution. So these are strong voices coming out in support and to suggest that there is nothing in the Origin of Species that necessitates atheism or a rejection of the Bible. However, the conflict myth becomes quite strong, and it is perpetuated by two books that are published at the end of the 19th century. One by John William Draper, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, and the second one by Andrew Dixon White, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology. And the titles in themselves give you clue to the content and to the fact that this is perhaps not history being retold in a sort of neutral vein. And then there is this man, Thomas Henry Huxley, who becomes a passionate advocate not only for Darwinian evolution, but espousing the view that it is in conflict with religion. Actually, I've just spent on the plane journey over here, I got 100 pages into reading a very fat biography of Thomas Henry Huxley. And as is always the case, when you delve into people's lives and their histories and their motivations, you start to understand a little bit about where they're coming from. And he particularly is someone who has no social status in Victorian England. And I don't know if they teach you any, probably don't teach you any English history, but in Victorian era, your hierarchy in your place of birth, whether you were noble or poor or in the middle, was all important. You got nowhere unless you had somebody rich and of the nobility to support you. You got nowhere without being patronaged by somebody who had authority and influence. And Huxley was himself both poor and had nobody really to speak for him. And a lot of the power in England at that time was in the hands of the church. So in order to get somewhere, you perhaps had to be the right kind of theological flavour, the right kind of vocabulary and so on. And Huxley had neither of these. Anyway, one of the things that is recorded somewhat mythically, it actually happened. There was a debate between Huxley and the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, who took against Darwin's theory. A lot of descriptions of the debate and how it was resoundingly won by Huxley. The problem is there are very few eyewitness accounts, so a lot of the descriptions of it are written after the event and are relying on either hearsay or, in the case of Draper, a little bit of polemic. So, yes, there's tension and conflict going on. Yes, Darwinian evolution has its strong supporters who speak as if it's against the church. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Just to give you a flavour of Draper's book on the conflict between religion and science, this is what Draper writes about the Galileo affair. So this is quite strong language. On his knees, with his hand on the Bible, he, Galileo, was compelled to abjure and curse the doctrine of the movement of the earth. What a spectacle! This venerable man, the most illustrious of his age, forced by threat of death to deny facts which his judges as well as he himself knew to be true. You can see from the tone of the language that this is polemic. There are no facts to support any of this account. This is Draper, several hundred years later, making a case from it. So the conflict myth is what Peter Bowler calls a metaphor. It's a metaphor of conflict that has been promoted as part of the rhetoric by which the new generation of professional scientists sought to establish themselves as a source of authority in an industrialized society. So people like Thomas Huxley, who had no status, no church connections, but was a budding scientist, were trying to carve out a place for themselves in the world that is still very elite, very dominated by the hierarchy of the system and of the church. Okay, well, it wouldn't do to be in Latin America and not make reference to the fact that Darwin spent quite a bit of time sailing around the coasts of Latin America. And as you can see from the map here, he spent quite a bit of time calling in at various places on the coast of Brazil. He spent 4 months in Brazil in 1832, and he wrote in his diary this on the 29th of February 1832. He said this: "The day has passed delightfully. Delight itself, however, is a weak term to express the feelings of a naturalist who has, for the first time, wandered by himself in a Brazilian forest." Oh, isn't that nice? He appreciated your forests. But what happened with Darwinism in Latin America? How was it received? Well, it spread quite quickly, his theory, and it provoked intense discussion in a lot of different forms. So, for example, Henry Burmeister, who was director of the Public Museum in Buenos Aires, published in 1867, so that's just 8 years after Darwin's work was published. He published a work called The History of Creation, and he was particularly concerned about the notion of common descent. And he said this: "Today, man and ape are both zoologically and psychologically distinct. And as we cannot abandon the principle of the invariability of species characters, without overturning the whole of scientific zoology. We have every reason to believe that the differences between them are primitive, have always existed, and will persist in the future. So those are quite strong words from someone who is opposed. No hint of religion there. He's opposed on really on metaphysical and epistemological grounds. He's concerned about abandoning principles and overturning the whole of scientific zoology. So these are foundational things that he's concerned about. And bottom line, you might say he's had his assumptions challenged and doesn't want to consider the alternative. A response to him, I've put this in because he's quite amusing, I think. I have never agreed with Dr. Burmeister, says what's his name? Weyenberger, Hendrik Weyenberg, who believes that the sons of the Argentinian Republic are incapable of serious work in the sciences. Dr. Burmeister has often told me that all Argentinians are inept boys from whom no work in the natural sciences can be expected. Now, I don't know what the relation is between Brazil and Argentina, so I'll leave you to decide if you agree with that or not. Please, if this is recording, it shouldn't go up on the web. But the issue actually is there a little bit between somebody who is German, is an incomer, colonial, and someone who is native and is feeling patronized by the European. So there is tensions there going on all the time. In Brazil, Emperor Pedro II was vehemently opposed to evolutionism, but his reasons might actually send a bit of a shiver down our spine. He wrote this letter in French. I continue to believe that the first man, the first human, was not black, neither was descended from a monkey. So in this, his concern is racial. And this is what, certainly in the research I've done over and over, the works published in English on the reception of evolution in Latin America, the concern is racial. And it's, of course, a context, I suppose, where questions about identity and who is the true Argentinian, who is the true Brazilian are being asked, where independence has been granted, and yet you have white settlers, you have African slaves who are now freed, and you have native South Americans. And these questions of race are driving concerns about evolution, particularly, I suspect, from the white settlers. The implications for the social structures of Latin America are crucial here. So I just think that's... and the other thing that's lingering, which also is worrying, and I'm not going to have time to talk about this, but is a sort of hint towards social Darwinism, which will come up, be something that emerges later. This is another Argentinian. As I was studying the amazing method that nature had devised for the development of living things, it seemed to me, and rightly so, that an analogous process must have taken place in the formation of our society. So still trying to maintain hierarchies, that there is an evolution of the civilized man from the uncivilized savage, the native, whatever. Those kind of ideas seem to be governing the thought at the time. And the point I'd like to make from that, and this is by no means an exhaustive study, but as far as I can see, that when Darwinianism hits Latin America, it's not religious concerns that are to the forefront. It's not a religious disagreement. It's more to do with the challenges to the status quo and the challenges to identity and so forth. Okay, I'm going to just very quickly talk a little bit about the 20th century. And I want to talk about two points, if you like, at which particularly evolution has caused pressure points. The first is the Scopes trial in 1925, which has been immortalized in a lot of films and books and was purported to be a challenge to the authority of the Bible. Now, this is a trial that takes place in a tiny little town in Tennessee in the deep Midwest of America. And this is the view of a book written about it. It cannot be held as confirmation of the inevitable conflict between science and religion. It had a lot more to do with local politics. It had to do with the choice of a textbook, a biology textbook for schools in Tennessee. It had to do with two very important people, the public prosecutor and a clergyman sort of slogging it out on the law court's floor. Yes, there was concern about evolution, but the issues at stake in the Scopes trial were not primarily to do with that, and it shouldn't be seen as an ongoing illustration of conflict. In fact, Ed Larson says that the trial, or the Scopes trial, embodied the characteristically American struggle between individual liberty and majoritarian democracy, and cast it in the timeless debate over science and religion. So again, you've noticed perhaps a thread running through this. There are, at each point, there are social and political and cultural and contextual issues going on at each point in which the conflict is, myths are put forward. And in a way, perhaps the idea of conflict between science and religion becomes a catch-all to kind of gloss over individual complexities and individual tensions in local areas. And it would be true to say, actually, that the Scopes trial effect really, I think, only was felt in America. It's very big there. It's very big in their sort of history of the relationship between science and religion, but not much elsewhere. I just want to talk a little bit about the 1960s onwards, because really the creationism as a kind of a sort of focus is something that is really only very recent. The emphasis that we've seen in the States and that is making its way across to Europe and I think down into Latin America is something that is relatively recent. And I know Dennis is going to be talking a little bit more later on today about creation and evolution and the relation between them. But I just wanted to highlight one or two things as I see it about the new movement of creationism. Some of the things that distinguish it are it's accompanied by quasi-scientific statements from the point of view of creationism. And it has a lot of category confusions and assumptions and sort of terminological issues. It's based on a particular view of biblical interpretation, which, as we've seen in some of the other quotes, is not warranted. And often I think it's at odds with ways that the Bible is used to address other issues. So there's not always consistency. I want to just got a couple of quotes. This is a quote from an American pastor, John Ortberg, who says, "I've seen too many young people in too many churches exposed to bad science, shoddy thinking, false claims, and the misguided idea that somebody was defending the Bible when what they were really defending was a wrong interpretation of the Bible." And then one other quote from another pastor in New York. Many people today, both secular and Christian, want us to believe that science and religion cannot live together. Not only is this untrue, but we believe that a thoughtful dialogue between science and faith is essential for engaging the hearts and minds of individuals today. So that's the debate in the 20th century, and I'm going to leave Dennis to unpack that a little bit more and give his own take on it. Let me just summarize where we've gone so far. Before secularism became the norm in the West, religion was so persuasive in social, political, and intellectual life that all but a very few people intuitively thought in a religious way. Hence, those studying the natural world were likely to be as religious as the general population. And if some of them were not religious or were atheistic or tended in that way, that was no more than in any of the rest of the population. Many people were motivated by their faith to explore the natural world and to understand better the Creator. They often saw the need to develop their own theological positions alongside new natural philosophies. And this is something new. So you have now people studying natural sciences who are having to think theologically. It had been the province of clergy and the church. And actually, in some cases, it was a very positive thing that you have people who are not priests studying theology, thinking theologically. People like Johannes Kepler, a very positive thing for the relationship between science and religion. In the 19th century, the professionalism of science, the fact that people are being paid to do it, the fact that societies of science are growing up, there's a desire to distinguish this from clergy and the church. And so the two become quite disassociated, not separated, but disassociated. Disagreements often had complex political and cultural roots rather than the expression of fundamental opposition to the theories. There's a differentiation between science and Christianity, but not a separation, as I've said. And there are plenty of 21st examples of scientists in this secular world who are still committed Christians, and I think that speaks for itself, and that the answer to the question is that there is no conflict between science and religion. Obrigada.
Obrigado. Thank you very much. Nós temos tempo para algumas perguntas. Quem quiser fazer alguma pergunta, por favor, levante a mão. Vamos começar lá do fundo. Está aqui, né, Marcelo? Mais alguém? Já levanta a mão para eu já identificar, que depois já vou mandando.
Tudo bom. Should I speak in English or Portuguese?
You choose.
Can I speak in English?
Please do.
Então, os brasileiros. My name is Thiago, Dr. Hillary, and I enjoyed it very much, and I was wondering if you had the opportunity of watching the new Cosmos that has just come out in America with Neil deGrasse Tyson. You know, the New Cosmos series. Okay, I'm asking about that because on the New Cosmos, I don't know if you guys are familiar here. Probably some of you have watched that. The first episode of Cosmos deals with Giordano Bruno, which is another very common myth in terms of the relationship between science and religion. And my question was actually related to the episode itself. So I'm just, since you didn't watch, I'm just going to share my thoughts for the people to debate maybe later. I don't know. But I thought they missed a very good opportunity to deconstruct this very popular myth, again, that Giordano Bruno was actually burned in the fire because of science. And they didn't exactly say with the exact words that he was burned because of his religious beliefs, or actually for his scientific beliefs, but they kind of let that implied, and they could have taken this opportunity to just clarify something that modern research has already proven. Just like you mentioned, these other researchers that have kind of deconstructed some of these myths. So, which in fact he was actually burned because of his theological ideas and not actually because of his scientific ideas. So it makes me sad to know to see that such a program with such a large audience is still working into promoting these myths. How do you feel about that? Like in the mass media, people are still working to promote these myths and this big conflict thesis instead of just trying to deconstruct it.
I think there's no doubt that any story in the news that has confrontation sells. It sells newspapers, or it gets headlines. So if you talk about agreement between two people, it doesn't make very big news. It's only when you have two senior people absolutely at each other's throat that it makes the front page of the newspaper. And I think that's what plays out here, is that it's more exciting to think in terms of story, of conflict. It's more exciting to think in terms of somebody being, science being at loggerheads with religion. And it feeds into the atheist agenda, which is to say that religion is outdated, outmoded, shouldn't be allowed to continue. And I find it with you sad that is the case with Bruno, but it's another illustration that it was far easier to upset the church on theological grounds than on scientific grounds. Now, the church could easily and did easily get upset over things, but theology was what provoked often provoked the controversy, not science.
Thank you. Any more questions down here?
Meu nome é Rogério, sou estudante do mestrado de Ciências da Religião da PUC, e a minha pergunta está mais relacionada à questão do neoateísmo, né? Como o neoateísmo faz questão de perpetuar esses mitos antirreligiosos, né? Principalmente Galileu, Giordano Bruno. E ultimamente, a gente tem notado um aumento da discussão antirreligiosa dentro dos meios virtuais, né? A propaganda que se faz em cima desses mitos, ela está muito relacionada à influência do pensamento neoateísta norte-americano e inglês, não é, também. Então, minha pergunta é o seguinte: quando você falou da questão do Brasil, da América Latina, e que estava muito mais relacionada à raça, né? Não houve mais certas discussões teológicas envolvendo a teoria de Darwin na América Latina? Porque no momento atual, o que a gente vê é um aumento desse discurso de mitos antirreligiosos, principalmente da militância cibernética.
I didn't come across in my research much written about the religious reception of Darwinism in the 19th century. So I don't know if there was any religious undercurrents then. When it comes to the neo-atheists, we tend to hear the voices that shout the loudest, and it's the same answer in a way as I gave before, that they're the ones that grab headlines, and quite often the controversial views, they seem to get priority just because they're loudest. So some of the neo-atheists are well known for trotting out extreme views on a number of different things that get them into a lot of trouble, but actually their voices get heard. And I suspect that the internet, in a way, perpetuates that, because you can just follow it up and follow it up. I don't know what the answer is, except that also to have a robust rebuttal of atheism and neo-atheism also in those fora, those web fora. And there are a lot of people that are doing that as well. One other thing I will say that's interesting, I know that, you know, there are some very well-known neo-atheists that have operated in the UK, and you notice I'm not naming. What has been interesting to me is that I've met a number of atheists who are very opposed to that view, that rhetoric, because they think that it actually is ideologically unsound. It's full of fallacies. It's not well argued. They feel that it's... In fact, I have a colleague at Coventry University who is herself an atheist, but who spends her time trying to deconstruct the neo-atheist rhetoric that comes out in the UK, and to get a more balanced view across that this is a question of, in both instances, whether you're a person of faith or an atheist, it's a question of ideology and worldview, and not to do with whether you're, you know, science and religion. So maybe it's not really an answer to your question, but I think that there is a tiredness in the UK of some of the extreme neo-atheist rhetoric. But I think that the trouble with the internet is that the people that spend all their time on internet forums are often those that have nothing better to do with their time, and just, you know... Sorry, I hope that there's not anybody here who... I hope the fact that you are here present now means you don't spend all your time on internet forums. That
Well, this is recorded for those who'll be watching online later on as well, so they'll be spending quite a lot of time.
Then they'll be very offended with me.
Boa tarde. Eu queria perguntar assim, se pelo caminho em que o conflito entre ciência e religião está tomando, na verdade são duas perguntas em uma. Se o conflito entre religião e ciência está tomando, a senhora acha que no futuro pode haver uma unidade reconhecida e aceita entre ciência e fé, de modo geral? E se acha, se a resposta for sim, a senhora pode sugerir algum ponto de unificação entre esses dois, entre esses dois conhecimentos?
That's a good question. I think personally I would say if I didn't have hope that progress could be made, I would not be working for the Faraday Institute or coming on these kind of conferences. I think that conversation is everything. It's so important that we're talking and we're able to engage in sensible conversation without hostility and anger. I think that there are so many points in which scientists who are people of faith and scientists who are not people of faith can agree on that there must be better conversations possible. A colleague of mine in Faraday, actually Ruth Bankovich of the Test of Faith, has recently, she's about to publish a book on awe and wonder in science, and she has interviewed a lot of Christian scientists to talk about beauty in nature and the wonder that they see and what makes them want to do science. And that sense of awe at the natural world is not unique to Christians who are scientists. Many, many scientists would tell you that they feel that. So I think that's a point of connection, and that's perhaps something that needs to be explored a little bit more. My other talk today is this course is going to be on environmental issues, and one of the things that I will tell you about then when I talk is an increasing awareness amongst people that are engaged in conservation biology that they need to listen and take account of people's worldviews, people's values, people's ethics. Because if they're working with people in parts of the world where they're trying to conserve nature, they need to take account of community values. And of course, in many parts of the world, those are religious. So I think there, again, there's a point of conversation. And I'm having a lot of conversations and other people between organizations that are working in conservation and organizations such as the Faraday and others that are concerned with thinking about the questions of value and ideology and theology.
Peter.
You're not allowed to ask me questions.
No, can I add another little point to that, which is that at least two of us in this room are working on a particle physics experiment, a big collaboration. And if you work in this sort of area, then you just got to do what the job requires. So if you go out to Geneva and work at the CERN lab, you find that people will have different political opinions, they will have different religious opinions. Certainly the lab frowns on sort of strong nationalistic opinions too. So people just have to work together, and that, I think, is a useful demonstration that it can be done.
So actually the lab brings people together and actually reduces the possibility of conflict, yes.